She mocked him for ignoring him during service and then slapped him in front of everyone. Little did she know that the black man in seat 2C was actually the CEO of the airline she worked for. The warm afternoon light streamed softly through the oval windows, casting a golden hue on the polished leather seats of the first-class cabin. There was a calm, almost stillness in the air, broken only by the quiet hum of the engines and the rustle of newspapers. Passengers were settling in, heads down, minds already drifting to their destinations or deadlines. Alexander stepped into the cabin with a steady gait, neither hurried nor hesitant. At 65, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had lived through storms both in the sky and on the ground. He wore a navy sweater over a crisp white shirt, khaki trousers, and well-worn brown leather shoes that had clearly traveled far. In one hand, he held a sleek navy duffel bag. His expression was calm, observant, almost invisible by design. Seat 2C awaited him, a window seat, quiet, private. He liked it that way. As Alexander reached for the overhead bin, a familiar ache flared in his left shoulder, an old reminder of his days as a fighter pilot flying through turbulence much fiercer than this. He paused, adjusted his grip, then glanced around, not out of helplessness, but simply because today, after a long string of meetings, he hoped someone might offer a hand. "Excuse me, miss, could you help me with this?" His voice was low, polite. A flight attendant approached, blonde hair pulled tightly into a bun. Her navy uniform perfectly pressed her posture, rigid with efficiency. Her name tag caught the light. Venus. She stopped, glanced at Alexander, and in that moment her expression shifted. Her eyes moved over him, top to bottom, and something unspoken passed between them. "You can manage that yourself, can't you?" She said, not kindly, not harshly, just dismissive. Alexander didn't react. He simply nodded quietly, lifted the bag again, the pain biting but familiar, and slid it into place. Across the aisle, a man in a gray suit looked up briefly, then back down at his phone, saying nothing. Taking his seat, Alexander folded his hands and looked out the window, the tarmac shimmering in the afternoon heat. He wasn't angry. Not yet. He was reflecting, measuring. This was his first flight since being named CEO of Norja Airlines. But no one here knew that, and that was exactly what he wanted. No press, no announcements. He had chosen this flight, this route, to see for himself how his airline treated its passengers, not when they were important, but when they were ordinary. Venus walked past him again, not offering a smile, not even a glance. Alexander exhaled slowly. Sometimes the smallest moments tell you everything. The plane had leveled at 30,000 feet, cutting through the sky with practiced ease. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting a soft, almost serene glow over the first-class passengers. Yet beneath that calm veneer, tension simmered in the small, unnoticed moments. Alexander sat quietly in seat 2C, his gaze flickering between the window and the magazine he held, though his mind wasn't on the words. He had noticed the shift almost immediately after takeoff. The way Venus, the flight attendant, had skipped over his route during the safety demonstration, directing her rehearsed charm instead toward the business travelers up front. The way her eyes had deliberately avoided his, as if acknowledging him was too much effort. It wasn't the first time Alexander had felt this. The cold edge of polite indifference, the subtle signs that didn't scream discrimination, but whispered it insidiously. As the beverage cart began its slow journey down the aisle, Venus's voice floated above the hum of the engines. She laughed lightly with a man in a tailored suit, offering him a drink before she even reached his row. Alexander waited, patient, observing. The cart rolled past him without pause. He cleared his throat gently. "Excuse me, I'd like a coffee. Black, please." Venus stopped, turned her head sharply and stared at him, as though he'd asked for something far more complicated. "We're very busy right now," she snapped. "I'll get to you when I can." She poured cranberry juice for the man beside him, who looked down at his laptop, uncomfortable fingers twitching nervously at the keys. Alexander didn't reply. He simply nodded once and returned his eyes to the page. Though the words meant little now, his thoughts were no longer on the article about loyalty programs. Instead, they lingered on the loyalty people gave to silence, the way others chose to stay quiet, to look away, to pretend that these small slights were nothing at all. It was never the loud moments that weighed the heaviest. It was these, the ignored requests, the glances filled with judgment, the invisible line that some people believe should never be crossed. Venus returned 10 minutes later, holding a small paper cup, as if it offended her to carry it. "Here's your coffee," she said, leaning awkwardly over him, letting a few drops spill onto his tray table. "Hope it's strong enough." Alexander looked at the cup, then at her. He didn't move, didn't speak. Then came the next blow. "I don't mean to offend you," she said, her voice louder now for everyone nearby to hear. "But you're not exactly the usual type we get up here. Are you sure you're in the right seat?" The words hung heavy in the air. Conversations around them faltered and a few heads turned. Alexander looked up, his face calm, unreadable. "What type do you usually get?" he asked, his tone still soft but firm. Venus hesitated, flustered, then defensive. "Business travelers, executives not." She stopped herself. "Some people think they can upgrade themselves or lie about their seat." "I didn't lie," Alexander replied evenly. "You can check my boarding pass." "I already did," she snapped, just trying to make sure no one's getting special treatment. Alexander leaned back slightly, letting her words linger. He didn't need to defend himself. He could see the truth etched across her face, in the way her voice sharpened whenever she spoke to him, in the way her smile never quite reached him. She wasn't used to seeing someone like him in this space. And the more he stayed composed, the more it unbalanced her. He returned to his seat, his mind steady. This was no longer just about service. It was about the quiet expectation some people carried, that power and status didn't belong to men who looked like him, who spoke with calm authority instead of loud demands. He thought of something his mother used to tell him as a boy in Oklahoma City. "They see you before you speak, don't give them more to fear." It had shaped him, molded the way he walked through the world, careful, composed, never too loud. But today something in him shifted. This wasn't just another slight to bear. This was something that needed to be seen for what it was. Across the aisle, a man in seat 3A leaned forward slightly. "That was uncalled for," he whispered. Alexander gave him a small nod. Nothing more. He had learned long ago that being the only one to speak up often meant being labeled the problem. So he waited. Venus moved down the cabin, her energy light and playful with others, but tense and guarded when near him. She joked with a couple in 1A and 1B, laughed about her dog, a show she loved. But when she turned back toward the rear, her face fell, the mask slipping. She wasn't done, Alexander could feel it. Something in her was still looking for a reason, a spark to justify what she already believed. And it wouldn't take much for that spark to become a flame. The plane soared high above the rugged deserts of New Mexico. But inside the first-class cabin, a different kind of pressure was building. One that had nothing to do with altitude. Alexander remained composed in seat 2C, though each minute that passed brought a deeper stillness to his face. Not a stillness of peace, but one of calculation. He could feel the shift in the cabin, not just from the engines, but from Venus's continued avoidance. The deliberate way she treated him like he didn't belong, like he was an anomaly that needed correcting. She returned once more, this time to collect trash. As she reached his row, Alexander calmly offered his empty cup and napkin. She looked at them as if they were contaminated. "I'm not your maid," she snapped, voice sharp, loud enough for others to hear. A soft gasp escaped from a woman in 1A. The man beside Alexander stiffened, but said nothing. Alexander's eyes remained steady. He set the cup and napkin gently on his tray table, turning to her for the first time with directness. "I believe your title is flight attendant," he said, voice even almost gentle. "You serve the cabin that includes me?" Venus's face flushed a deep red, rising from her neck. This wasn't the response she wanted. She wanted outrage. She wanted defiance. Instead, she was met with measured dignity. "I don't like your tone," she hissed, leaning in. "I haven't raised it." Her eyes narrowed. "I don't care who you think you are. You people always think you can act like you own the place." The words cut through the air, cold and unmistakable. Alexander tilted his head slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean, you people?" The silence that followed was deafening. It happened fast. Her hand, open palm, came down hard across his face. A sharp crack echoed through the cabin, freezing every sound, every breath. The man in 2A stood halfway out of his seat. A woman in row 3 let out a gasp, and somewhere behind a phone camera clicked into action. Venus's hand hovered in the air, trembling as if even she couldn't believe what she'd done. Her eyes widened, panic setting in. Alexander didn't move. He didn't touch his cheek or raise his voice. He simply looked at her, calm, steady, unyielding. Passengers began to murmur, the air thick with shock and disbelief. A younger flight attendant, Nora, hurried down the aisle, her face pale. "What happened?" she whispered harshly, pulling Venus aside. "He was being rude." Venus muttered, her voice dry, crumbling. Alexander slowly rose, adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, and turned toward the gathering crowd. Someone behind him spoke up. "She hit him. We all saw it." Nora stepped forward, her eyes on Alexander. "Sir, are you all right?" "I'm fine," he replied, dabbing a small cut on his lip with a napkin. "But this isn't over." Venus stood, frozen color draining from her face. She tried to speak but couldn't find the words. "Go to the galley." Nora said, her voice firm. Venus didn't move now. With stiff shoulders and hollow eyes, Venus turned and walked away. The cabin was silent as Alexander sat back down. The passengers around him watched, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of something deeper, respect perhaps, or the weight of realizing they had witnessed something profoundly wrong. "Sir, do you want to press charges?" a man asked quietly from across the aisle. Alexander didn't look at him. His eyes rested on the Norjet logo on the headrest in front of him. "No," he said, his voice low but resolute. "But this isn't going away." Then from the back, a voice, small but certain, rose. "That's Alexander," a woman whispered. "Alexander Mayfield, he's the CEO." The name spread like wildfire, whispered row to row, until it wasn't a secret anymore. Phones came out, searches were made, and there it was, his face, his name, on Norjet's website. The CEO, seated quietly in 2C, now fully revealed. The murmurs turned to gasps, some of disbelief, others of regret. A man in 1B stood, his face pale. "Is that true?" he asked. Alexander finally turned, nodding once. "Yes, it is." The weight of the truth settled over the cabin like a storm. Outside, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing the descent into San Francisco. But inside, all eyes remained on Alexander. Venus did not return. Nora crouched beside him again. "Mr. Mayfield, I'm truly sorry. I didn't know who." Alexander shook his head gently. That's not the point. You treated me with respect before you knew my name. That's what matters. Nora's eyes welled, but she nodded understanding. We'll report this. Not because of who I am, he said softly, but because it was wrong. As the plane began its slow descent, the light from the fading sun cast long shadows across the cabin. First class had grown uncharacteristically quiet. Conversations once light and filled with muted laughter had stilled. The slap had changed everything, but what came next would upend the balance completely. Alexander sat composed, eyes forward, hands resting lightly on his knees. The sting on his face had faded, but a deeper ache lingered, one not born of physical pain, but of the silent complicity he had seen too many times before. Across the aisle, passengers whispered, their voices hushed but hurried. The truth had begun to spread. Someone had recognized him, and now the name Alexander Mayfield was bouncing between rows like a live current. Phones lit up with searches confirming what few dared to believe. Norjet Airlines CEO sitting quietly in 2C. The man they had watched be insulted, ignored, and struck. The woman in 5A who had first spoken his name now leaned closer to her seatmate, her voice trembling with realization. I saw the announcement last month. He's a retired Air Force colonel, and now he's leading Norjet's new diversity and ethics initiative. A man in 1B turned around, staring at Alexander with wide eyes. He stood slowly, almost reverently. Is it true? He asked, his voice cracking slightly. Are you him? Alexander turned, his face calm. He gave a single, deliberate nod. Yes. The weight of that one word rippled through the cabin. A murmur of shock, embarrassment, and regret filled the air. People who had turned away earlier, who had said nothing when Venus dismissed him, now felt the shame of their silence. Nora, the younger flight attendant, returned from the galley. Her face was pale, her steps hesitant as she approached. Mr. Mayfield, she said, crouching beside his seat again. I didn't know. I'm so sorry. You treated me with respect, Alexander replied softly. Before you knew who I was, that's what matters. Tears welled in Nora's eyes, but she nodded. We've notified the ground crew. Supervisors will meet you at the gate. Venus has been removed from duty for the rest of the flight. Alexander nodded once, then looked around. Eyes met his now, not with curiosity, but with something closer to reverence. He didn't want it. He hadn't come here to be a CEO. He had come to be a man among others, a man with a ticket, a man who should have received the same dignity given freely to those deemed worthy. The plane landed smoothly, but the air remained heavy, as if no one dared to move first. The captain's voice, calm and rehearsed, announced their arrival, but it felt like a different world now. As the doors opened, two supervisors in Norjet uniforms stood at the entrance. One, a tall black man with a clipped badge, stepped forward. Mr. Mayfield, I'm Alan Ricks, Regional Operations Director. We were notified mid-flight first. I want to personally apologize for everything that happened. Alexander stood, collecting his bag with a steady hand. I'm not here for apologies, Alan. I'm here for accountability. The second supervisor, a white woman named Terry, nodded quickly. We've flagged the incident for immediate review. The flight logs, the passenger statements, everything. Make sure it's real, Alexander said. Not a PR patch-up. Alan met his eyes, understanding the weight behind those words. Yes, sir. As Alexander stepped into the jet bridge, the buzz of his phone vibrated against his side. The video had gone viral, over 2 million views in just an hour. Headlines were already forming, voices debating, dissecting. But none of that mattered yet. Outside the terminal, cameras hadn't gathered yet. Inside him, the real work was already beginning. That evening, in a quiet conference room at Norgay headquarters, Alexander met with the Internal Ethics Committee. No PR staff, no lawyers. Just the people responsible for building the system that had failed. Bias training has become a checkbox. He began, voice steady. Complaints get buried and silence is safer than speaking out. That ends now. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. He laid it out. How frontline employees learn behavior from a culture that looked away. How passengers were made to feel invisible, and how leadership had allowed it to fester. I wasn't hurt by a slap. He said, I've taken worse in fighter jets. What hurt was the silence. The way 20 people watched and did nothing. I don't blame them. I blame us for creating a system where it feels safer to ignore what's wrong. There was no response at first. Then Maritza, a senior HR director, nodded, eyes shining. We'll fix it. Over the next days, Alexander didn't issue a statement about Venus. He didn't need to. Her suspension became permanent after old footage surfaced, revealing a pattern. But this wasn't about one person. It was about a system Norjet launched. The Listening Line, an anonymous platform where employees and passengers could report discrimination without fear. They overhauled complaint processes and introduced seat check rotating flight attendants between cabins to break comfort zones. Some resisted. It's too fast. They said Alexander's reply was simple. Too fast compared to what? The speed of disrespect. The hotel room in downtown San Mateo was silent, except for the occasional hum of traffic outside. Alexander sat near the window, the city lights blinking below like scattered stars. His phone rested on the table beside him, still vibrating intermittently as notifications flooded in. Media requests, social commentary, internal emails. The video was everywhere now. Flight attendant slaps black passenger, unaware he's the CEO. It wasn't just a story, it was a storm, but Alexander wasn't thinking about the headlines. He wasn't interested in the noise or the public outrage. He was thinking about what the slap represented. It wasn't just one moment, it was a lifetime of moments. Small, quiet humiliations. The countless times people like him had been dismissed, doubted, diminished. Not because of their ability, but because of their appearance. And the deeper truth, most of those moments had passed, unseen, unrecorded, unchallenged. He knew he could make this about him. He could sit in front of cameras, give interviews, become the symbol they wanted, but that wasn't enough. He wanted to make sure no one else had to sit in seat 2C and feel alone. Later that night, Alexander called a private meeting with Norjet's ethics and operations teams. No executives, no PR. I'm not looking for statements. He began, his voice low but firm. I'm looking for change. Around the virtual table, faces appeared. HR directors, training leads, compliance officers. Many looked shaken, others thoughtful. Too many people in this company have learned how to act. He continued, but not how to care. He laid out the pattern he had seen, how unconscious bias training had become a formality, a box to tick, how complaints from both passengers and employees often disappeared into silence, how those at the front lines had absorbed bad habits from a culture that valued appearances more than people. We've built a system where the safest thing to do is nothing. Alexander said, that ends here. Over the next week, Norjet didn't just release a press statement, they overhauled their internal structures. 1. The Listening Line. An anonymous reporting system open 24/7 where both employees and passengers could submit concerns. Every report would be reviewed with guaranteed follow-up and real consequences. 2-seat check, a mandatory rotation policy ensuring flight attendants served across all cabin classes, eliminating comfort zones and habitual biases. 3. Bias re-education. Not just a seminar, but ongoing scenario-based training led by specialists focusing on real-world situations and the emotional impact of microaggressions. 4. Leadership accountability. Supervisors would now undergo quarterly reviews, not just on performance metrics, but on how effectively they handled ethical concerns. Some within the company pushed back, "This is too much." One director argued, "It's too fast." Alexander didn't flinch. Too fast compared to what, he asked? The speed of disrespect. The years of silence. Silence followed, but it was the kind that precedes understanding. Meanwhile, Venus's suspension became permanent. No public spectacle, no further comment from Alexander. An older video surfaced showing her speaking harshly to a young Latino boy traveling alone. The pieces fit. This wasn't a one-time lapse. It was a pattern, but Alexander didn't celebrate her fall. "This isn't about her," he told Maritza, the senior HR director. "It's about what we allowed." At an industry conference 2 weeks later, executives expected Alexander to speak about growth strategies, fleet expansions, profitability. Instead, he told them about Flight 1627. He didn't name Venus. He didn't even name himself. He spoke about a man in seat 2C, a man with tired bones and an honest ticket, a man who asked for nothing more than respect and got contempt. "If we can't guarantee that for every person who boards our planes," Alexander said, looking around the room, "then we're failing at the most basic part of this business, human decency." The room was silent, not from apathy, but from the weight of truth. Afterward, a young black employee approached him near the exit. "Mr. Mayfield," she said, voice shaking slightly, "what you did, it gave me hope." He smiled gently, not with pride, but with shared understanding. "Hold the door open for someone else." He said, "That's how we change things." 2 weeks passed. The viral frenzy faded, replaced by the next scandal, the next trending outrage. But Alexander didn't forget. He returned to Norget's headquarters through the same back entrance he'd once used as a junior analyst. No cameras, no fanfare, just purpose. On his desk sat a folder, 200 letters from employees, passengers, even former staff. Stories of being overlooked, silence passed by, different faces. Same thread, Alexander read everyone. Then he launched one more initiative. The listening line wasn't just for complaints. It was for ideas, for stories, for people who had something to say, but never had the chance. Because justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet shift that stays. The training center in Albuquerque wasn't glamorous. The building was old, tucked behind a cluster of warehouses near the airport, with faded signage and a dated interior that still smelled faintly of coffee and paper. But to Alexander, this place mattered. It was here that thousands of Norjet employees, from flight attendants to gate agents, came to learn the heart of the company, or at least what it was supposed to be. He didn't announce his visit. No entourage, no press, just a man walking through familiar halls carrying nothing but a notebook and a quiet determination. Alexander slipped into the back of a training session already in progress. The facilitator was walking a group of new flight attendants through customer service protocols, how to greet passengers, handle complaints, maintain efficiency. The room was filled with nods, scribbled notes, but also the kind of detachment that comes with routine. When the session ended, Alexander stood slowly. "May I say something?" he asked. The room turned, some eyes widening in recognition, others confused by his presence. "I know it's easy," he began, "to believe that things like bias, disrespect, and silence only happen in places far from here, that they're someone else's problem, but I need you to understand something. I've sat in that seat. He paused, letting his words sink in. I've been ignored, insulted, and judged, not as a CEO, but as a man. And if it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. The room was silent, not out of fear, but out of realization. Alexander didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence filled the space with something more powerful than authority truth. After the session, as people filtered out, a young woman lingered by the coffee machine, glancing at Alexander with hesitation. He noticed, walked over, and poured himself a cup. "Something on your mind?" he asked, voice kind. She smiled nervously. "You ever think about walking away after everything that happened?" Alexander stirred his coffee. Thoughtful. "I did," he admitted. "But then I remembered change doesn't happen when you leave the room. It happens when you stay long enough to fix what broke." She nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over her like a quiet challenge. Over the next few weeks, Alexander's approach was personal. He didn't just sit in boardrooms. He walked the halls. He visited break rooms, sat in on team meetings, listened not as a CEO but as a colleague. He understood that real change wasn't born from policies alone, but from trust. At Norget headquarters, he initiated a new series called Voices of Norget, an open forum where employees at every level could share their stories anonymously or openly. Some were painful, others inspiring, all were real. One letter stood out. A janitor wrote, "I've worked here for 10 years. Most days people don't even see me. But after hearing what you went through, I feel seen for the first time." Alexander read that line over and over. That was why he stayed. Not for retribution, but for recognition. That every person, no matter their role, deserved respect. He didn't need the spotlight. He didn't crave it. Instead, he focused on embedding change. Ethics mentors. Senior employees were trained to mentor new staff on real-world challenges, focusing on empathy, accountability, and respect. Frontline leadership review supervisors were now evaluated by those they managed, creating a culture of shared responsibility. Recognition beyond titles. Monthly. Alexander personally highlighted stories of employees who demonstrated kindness and integrity no matter how small the act. These weren't just initiatives, they were shifts in how the company breathed, how it saw itself. One morning, Alexander received an email. Venus's attorney had issued a statement. She was seeking help for stress and behavioral issues, expressing regret for her actions. It was short, clinical, designed to stem public backlash. Alexander read it once, then closed the message. He didn't respond publicly. He didn't need to. Instead, he sent one short internal memo. "Dignity is not earned by title. It is owed to every human being. That's the culture we build together." A month later, Alexander boarded another flight. This time, no one knew his name. He took a seat in economy beside a young mother and her child. The flight attendant smiled as she passed, offering water without hesitation, kindness in her voice. Alexander leaned back, watching the clouds drift past. The work wasn't done, but for the first time the sky felt a little more open. 2 months had passed since the flight that changed everything. The headlines had faded, replaced by newer controversies, fresher stories. But for Alexander, the real measure of that day wasn't found in the media cycle. It was in the quiet shifts that remained long after the cameras moved on. At Norget's headquarters, the atmosphere was different. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but subtle, almost imperceptible. Yet real employees walked with more awareness. Supervisors listened more carefully, and in the break rooms, conversations that once might have been avoided were now happening. Honestly, openly, the listening line had received hundreds of submissions. Not all were complaints. Many were stories. Moments where someone had stood up, spoken out, or simply chosen to see another person with respect. Alexander read them all. Some brought a smile, others a heavy pause, but each one was a sign that change was taking root. He didn't need to remind people of who he was. He didn't need to bring up the slap. The lesson had already been written, not in words but in action. One morning as Alexander walked through the office, a young man from the IT department approached him. "Mr. Mayfield," he said almost shyly, "I just wanted to thank you, not for what happened, but for what you did after." Alexander smiled softly. "It's not about me, but it started with you," the man replied, "and now it's different here." Alexander nodded, understanding. "It's only different," he said, "because people decided to make it different. I just stayed long enough to help." Later that day, Alexander sent out a message, not a press release, not a formal memo, but a note. "We don't change the world by grand gestures. We change it by small acts of dignity, repeated until they're no longer questioned. Every person matters, every voice counts, and every seat, whether in first class or at the back, deserves respect. Let's not forget." There was no signature, no title beneath the words. It didn't need one. The message wasn't about a CEO. It was about a culture, a commitment. That evening, Alexander left the office quietly as he always did. No fanfare, just a man with a purpose fulfilled, knowing that true leadership isn't about being seen, but about seeing others, clearly, fully, equally. And as he stepped out into the cool evening air, he knew this was only the beginning. Life isn't about grand moments or perfect plans. It's about the quiet, simple choices we make every day. It's in how we treat others when no one's watching, how we carry ourselves when the world feels heavy, and how we choose to rise after we've fallen. True strength isn't loud. It's the quiet persistence to keep going, to hold on to kindness in a world that often forgets it. Success isn't measured by what we have, but by the impact we leave, in hearts, not headlines. There will be days when the path seems unclear, when doubts whisper louder than dreams. But trust that every step, no matter how small, is part of something greater. Growth takes time, and so does healing. Respect, love, and integrity are never wasted, even if they go unnoticed. They build a life of meaning, one moment at a time. So take a breath, give yourself grace, and remember, the most beautiful lives aren't the loudest, but the ones lived with quiet purpose, deep compassion, and the courage to keep believing in something better. Because life in the end is not about being perfect. It's about being real,